Thanks for getting out of bed. It's a cold morning. These are the faithful people here. The connection this week, did you get it? It's not real easy. And I want to say this is between the Genesis. We're reading the Genesis story of Joseph and Mark, and they don't always necessarily match. It's just that there's a connection. The connection can be a complete contrast, or it can just be some element that is a connection. But we're looking for connections, not perfect matches. So don't get frustrated in that. Just look for connections and see what happens. Because those of us who read through the Bible every year, we see, and I switch it up every year, we see that everything is always connected. The Bible's always connected. Of course, the Gospel of Mark is going to be connected to Genesis. So let's seek to see those connections. And today what it is it's kind of one of those opposites, is it's solitary. Joseph gets thrown into solitary, a dark place, all by himself. And Jesus chooses solitary. He gets up early in the morning, before everyone's awake, while it's still dark, and sneaks out of town and finds a dark, solitary place where he can be by himself. See? There it is. And the plot really thickens in the Joseph story, and I've heard from some people who are doing the reading, and I hope if you haven't jumped on the wagon, there's plenty of room. Jump on and start reading this each day. It's on a blog online. You can save it on your phone. It's really easy to do. We've got the cards in the back lobby. You can go to our website to find that blog. And we're taking the Joseph story in such small portions that I've heard from a couple of you. Do you hear me? I've heard from a couple of you that you're really digging into the story more because of that. You know, usually you just go and you'd keep reading till you got tired of reading, or the chapter ends, or, you know, that's not what this is about. We're doing I Am Joseph. And so what we're trying to do is use our imaginations and imagine ourselves in Joseph's place. And so as the plot thickens, we want to do that more and more. And we want to bring all of our stuff, which we can't help it anyway. We're going to bring our stuff in to that same place. And so it might bring out some old memories and help you work those through. I think that's good, and that could be very healing. And then it might help you deal with something right now. And that's the idea. We want to really feel what Joseph is feeling. We want to be in that moment. He's like a good actor that really puts us there with him. I am Joseph. So can you relate with Joseph getting thrown into the pit? You ever been in the pit before? When I was growing up, my brother and his friends never threw me into the pit, but one time they did try to throw me in the pool. And I was always, in my stubbornness, they weren't going to, I was a rascal, and you weren't going to get off easy throwing me in the pool. You know, you're either coming with me and getting in the pool too, or I'm going to run away. And so I scurried off, and I was a quick little mouse. And so I got away and jumped over a fence. And as I'm laughing that I'm away from them, I land on this electrical thing sticking up out of the ground, one of these boxes, and it just tore open my shin. So I still have the scar today. That's pretty cool. We do that families do that to each other, do we not? That was just horsing around. That was unintentional, but we hurt each other. We throw each other into the pit. Some of us have been really thrown into the pit by our families. That has happened. That's some really tough stuff. You see where someone is thrown into the pit and They spend their entire life in the pit. That's a pit that they carry around with for the rest of their lives, or Jesus heals them, and sometimes that takes time. And this is a healing place, so we want to find healing from that. And just thinking about it, what was this place they were? Remember, they left Shechem, the spiritual place, and then they went to Dothan. And so it's this place with these pits. It sounds terrible. Oh, let's throw them into one of the pits hanging around here. I guess they were digging for wells, and when they didn't get to water, they just left the pit there. Sounds pretty dangerous. And so this place, Dothan, was literally the pits, and they were throwing, people into the pit. How awful. And then, so we grow up in our families, and then we get a little bit older, and we start dating, and then we get dumped, and that's definitely the pits. If you haven't ever been dumped, then shame on you, because then you haven't really lived, have you? You can't relate with blues music. You're missing a lot of life. You need. I started to realize I would tell the youth group, you need to get dumped if this is part of life. Don't think you're supposed to be. You're not a better person if you've never been dumped. You're a better person if you have. So, but it's the pits emotionally. That's for sure. So we can remember that, and that can even still sting today, and have some lasting impact on us that we need to get healed from. We can fall from grace at work. That happens. We can get sacked. He's been sacked. That happens. That's actually how I went into seminary full time. I had a job, and God was clearly leading me to seminary, to the fact that I applied, went and looked at seminaries, went to a seminary. God was like, this is the one. Murray and I walked in, and then I was taking a class. So it was clear that God, but I wasn't ready to quit my job and jump fully into that. And then right around that time when I was taking that first class, and the professor said, who's here? Who's here for their first class? And a few of us raised their hands because it was one of the ones that you're going to take early on. He said, something happens your first class. I just want to let you know. God does something. And so then I go to work, and the boss calls me in and gives me this talk where I just felt like I've fallen from grace here. I'm on thin ice, and just felt like it was really what I needed to say, get out of here. You're not supposed to be here. And turned out later on that he called me like a year later and said, how's seminary going? Because we miss you. We'd really love you back. And I'm like, I remember a discussion like in talking to another guy that worked there. He's like, no, that's his motivational speech. I'm like, that's really poor. That doesn't work with me. It might work with some other people. But but God uses, that's what God does. And so we can get thrown in the pit, a health or a financial crisis. We could get thrown into the pit. There's one Psalm 88, that says, it says, God, you threw me in the pit. That's what it says. It's the only Psalm, this is to my reading, that doesn't have a turnaround. There's these lament songs, and usually there's this lament, but then God, but you saved me. And then there's this turnaround. Psalm 88 is the only one that it's in the pit, and it starts in the pit and ends in the pit. It's just there. But the positive, the silver lining is that the person's praying. And so, Jeff McNeil, not last year, but right before last year, so the end of 2015, lost his brother, and his brother's wife were in a car just driving, and bam, they were gone. And, that's the pits. and he's now up in Philadelphia with their two sons, his two nephews, who he's been trying to encourage over this time and comfort, because the trial for the driver is happening right now. So he's trying to keep them from going down into that deep, deep, dark pit. So, and we can pray for him. You know, I am Joseph. What about you? Let's associate with Joseph. What, as I've been talking about this, has any of this rang true for you? What pits have you been thrown into? Are you in one right now? Think of Joseph crying out. I mean, if you imagine yourself as Joseph, he is crying out, "Don't leave me here. Don't leave me, brothers. Don't leave me down here, stuck at the bottom of this pit." So in contrast, what happens is the connection to the gospel is Jesus chooses solitary. He had the exact opposite. Joseph had a bad day that day. He shows up, his brothers take away his nice coat, take that from him, and wrestle with him and throw him at the bottom of a pit. That's a bad day. Jesus had a great day. He goes and gets the disciples, and four of them, anyway. This is the very beginning of his ministry. He walks into Capernaum, the biggest city in the area in Galilee, and that's near where he's from. So, this is the nearby big city. And he goes in there, and he goes into the synagogue and takes authority in his teaching, and everyone's amazed. He heals a demon-possessed person, a boy, right there in the synagogue. He goes home to Peter's house, heals his mother-in-law, and then at the end of Sabbath, everybody, once the sun goes down, everybody in the town carries their sick people to Jesus. They're all amazed. So he had this great 24-hour period that we looked at last week. So he had this great day. And so what does he choose to do that next day? He chooses to get up before dawn, get up while everyone else is still asleep, sneak off, and be by himself. And when the disciples come to him, he says, "No, I'm not going back there. We need to keep moving." So he really shows us what to do when you're in the pit. Okay, you're in the pit. Jesus put himself there. What should we do? He gives us the example. This we need to be doing this. I did it this morning. I got up before dark and listened to God and tried to practice this. Usually I only get up like that if I'm woken up by anxiety, that 3 a.m, and you can't sleep and you're tossing and turning. And then you go ahead and pray. You go to that place, that quiet place, and pray. We should be more intentional. So what does Jesus do there? What does he make good out of it? Well, first of all, he prays. He went there to pray. So he's taking advantage of that time with the Lord. Some of our sweetest times with Jesus are when we were in a pit, wasn't it? It just was. If we look back, when we felt all alone, felt like people were piling on, they weren't helping us. They were all against us, and we were just by ourselves, and it was dark and depressing and lonely. And Jesus came to us, and we relied on him. And when looking back, you realize that was one of my best times with Jesus, because I didn't rely on anything else. We get put in that situation. C.S. Lewis says, pain is God's microphone. The rest of the time we're not listening. We have to get in that quiet space, and then all of a sudden we hear, whoa, there's God. I mean, like this morning, I didn't hear, sometimes you think, oh, I'll do that, and then all of a sudden there'll just be this revelation or vision or God will visit me. That's no, not often. But there's a connection. You know, I had a connection with God this morning in that time. I can't tell you exactly what he told me. It wasn't one of those. He's spoken to me before, but you know, just to feel that connection with him in that space. That's prayer. And, you know, when we rely on him and not these other things that we think are propping us up, then we really do find peace. So pray when you're in the pit. And then the other one is move to mission. The disciples, it says, hunted him down. That's how aggressive they were. That's the word Mark used. It wasn't they went and found him. They hunted him down. They did their they looked for his tracks and used their noses and found him. And then what happened was for Jesus when he was there in that quiet time, what happened was a sense of mission took over him. Instead of any human being that's working on worldly thinking would have gone back to Capernaum and built on what all this popularity that he had achieved. And instead he says, no, we're not going back there. The disciples are super excited. That's where they're from. That's where Peter's house was. Remember? They went in there and it was Peter's house. And so he's like, man, he's taken over this town and this is great and let's keep this rolling. And, you know, there probably was some more people to heal and some more to do. But Jesus says, no, we're going to move on because that's why I've come. That's what God is calling me to do. And so in that time, he was probably praying and looking for God. Obviously, it had been successful, but God, really, what do you want me to do? Because we tend to follow the success. That's what we do. A ministry is great if, it's successful. And how do we determine what's successful? Well, there's numbers of people, and there's money, and this is what's successful. And that's not what God did. That wasn't how Jesus worked. He just said, he went to that quiet place and said, God, where do you want me? And God said, I want you moving on. And so move on is, and that's one of the good things about the pit is it means it's time to move on, okay? When you find yourself at the bottom of the pit, it's time to move. Something's got to change. It is that, we've hit bottom, and now there's something new. And so in some ways that's a good thing. And Jesus chose it. Jesus chose the change. Joseph was thrust into the change. And so this move on idea could be a little too harsh for when you're trying to comfort someone who is in the pit or trying to get out of the pit and you say move on. That could for them make them feel like you're kind of belittling their suffering. So we don't want to necessarily do that. And we don't want to make anyone think that we're tired of suffering with them, because I think that can happen too, is people can feel like, I'm sorry for continuing to bring all this bad stuff to you, that I'm still in this pit. I'm trying to get out, but we're still right here. So I know you're tired of it. And so sometimes we have to be careful with move on, because we give them that thought where that's not usually what we're thinking. We're thinking, no, I'm right here with you. I'm going to stick with you. But move on to mission is a good idea. Not move on, get over it, but move on to mission. Move to mission. And it's the idea that, no matter where we are right now, today, or where we've been, God is a really good story writer. And tomorrow is a new page. he has a mission. He has a purpose. There's twists and turns we don't understand in his stories, but he makes good. We can't make up for our mistakes, but we can make good out of them. There's a light at the end of the tunnel. Move to it. Move to mission. And then think of, when we're thinking of I Am Joseph, think about the moment he's at the bottom of the pit, and then they throw some ropes down, and they pull him up, and he's like, oh, it was just a prank. Oh, it's okay now. He had that thought for a second, and it's like, nope, now you're sold into slavery. Now you're gone. That's the ultimate psych, isn't it? It's interesting we have a narrator in this story. Did you notice? We have a narrator. You can imagine Morgan Freeman's voice if you'd like. That's kind of my favorite guy. Maybe James Earl Jones. Got a good narrator. And he doesn't explain Joseph's thoughts very often, which is really interesting. He does explain thoughts. He explains the brothers' jealousy. He explains Jacob pondering Joseph's dream. He explains, in this passage, that Reuben had done this, said throw him in the pit, because Reuben desired to come back later and save Joseph. And he forgets to tell us what Reuben did, because obviously Reuben somehow left when they had this idea of taking him out and selling him, because then Reuben came back and tore his clothes and said, what am I going to do? But we've got a narrator in this story, and it's really nice, and he tells us some thoughts, but with Joseph, he doesn't always tell us what Joseph's thinking. And I think that's maybe intentional, because what we're to do is use our imagination. If he just told us what Joseph was thinking, then maybe it wouldn't draw us in as much. So he's not going to tell us. Not always. And so we have to imagine. We have to do the I Am Joseph work of asking and feeling and saying, how would I feel if that happened to me? Has that happened to me? Oh my gosh, it has. I remember that. And the Joseph story is, it's not just about Joseph. First of all, it's God's story. That's the whole Bible is God's story. And when our story is really good, it's God's story. So it's God's story, but just like our story, where we kind of think of ourselves as the main character, we are the main character in each of our movies. Okay, you are the star of a movie. It's called Your Life Story. All right, you get to be the star, but there's always other very significant characters, aren't there, in everyone's story? And so we want to learn from the other characters as well. So it's not just I am Joseph, it's I am Jacob, I am Judah, I am Reuben. We want to do that as well. And two other characters emerge here, and because when the narrator says their name, they become, when you get the name out, okay, pay attention to this one. This one matters. And this story is multi-layered. It's not just about Joseph. There's a lot of other stuff going on, and we want to recognize that. So two names come up, Reuben and Judah. So let's talk about those guys. Reuben was the firstborn of all of Jacob's sons, of all 12. He was the firstborn. And remember, Jacob loved Rachel, but then Laban tricked him and made him marry Leah. And so it had to be hard for Leah because they were both married to him. But Jacob loved Rachel. And so God just so happened to open Leah's womb. So Leah's the one that started having children. And so the first child's name is Reuben, which means see a son. See a son. Will you love me now? Can I be your favorite now? I am Leah. Will you love me? Because I have a son now. And so he is that firstborn son. And by human tradition, he's the one that the covenant is going to go through. And something else that's going on in this story is Jacob's wondering, because if we go back in Genesis, the covenant always goes through one of the brothers. And remember, he kind of stole it, even with his mom's help, from his brother Esau. It went through Isaac instead of Ishmael. So he's thinking, I have this whole mess of sons. Who's it going to go through? And of course, Reuben, the oldest, is the traditional choice. But he made a serious mistake. And so what happened was, right before this Joseph story, it's just a little tiny blurb, but he went in and slept with Bilhah, which was Rachel's handmaiden, which is one of Jacob's 4 wives, the mother of Dan and Naphtali, his half-brothers. And plus it was bad timing because Rachel had just died. And so Jacob found out about it, and he would not forget. In the blessings of the 12 sons that comes later in Genesis, he says, Jacob says about Reuben, "You will not be foremost, for you defiled my couch to my sorrow." So, number 1 son, out. He's out. He's out of the running. Jacob is not going to give the covenant to him. He's made that mistake. And a big one. But what we see, and this is a reoccurring theme in Genesis and the Joseph story and the rest of the Bible and our lives, is that we make a mistake. We make more than one mistake. But what happens is we change. We transform. God changes us. We grow up a little bit. They often say, failure is the only way we really learn. If we're doing everything right, it never really lodges in there. But you make a mistake, and you're going to remember that. And so, like I was saying, we can't always make up for a mistake. There's no way. Reuben could not make up for this mistake. This was one of those mistakes that you're going to live with this the rest of your life. And your father's not going to forget this. But he can still do good. And that's what we see. We make mistakes. We can't fix those mistakes, but we learn and we change and we can do some good things. That's the reoccurring theme. And that's what we see with Reuben. I called it here transformation to empathy. See, Reuben was only thinking of himself, when he went in there and slept with Bilhah. He was only thinking of himself. He was thinking of nobody else in the consequences. Only his short-term physical desires was what he was thinking about. Now, he's changed, and we see it. We see that he's changed. Now he's not just thinking of himself. Look, he's the oldest, and Joseph seems to be this cherished one. He would be the one that would be the most jealous, right? I'm the oldest. I'm the one that's supposed to get the special coat. The covenant's going to go through me. I'm going to get the inheritance. I'm going to have the power over this community that God's going to turn into a nation. I'm going to be the king. But why is Joseph having these dreams that he's the authority? And why is my dad loving him so much and giving him these special gifts? So he had the most motivation to kill Joseph. But he doesn't, because he's changed. He's been transformed through his mistake. There's a transformation to empathy that has taken place. And so he thinks of Joseph. He thinks of his father. He even thinks of God. And he intervenes. He has a plan to somehow save Joseph. It doesn't work perfectly, but in essence, he did save Joseph's life. He saved it. Otherwise, they would have just killed him. And so his idea was, of course, let's throw him in the pit and leave him there, And then, come on, brothers, let's keep going. And then he sneaks off by himself and goes and pulls Joseph out. That's what he wanted to do. That didn't happen for him, but he did save Joseph's life. And so he wasn't just thinking of himself. So he had been transformed to empathy. And that's a good thing that happens when we make, that comes, it's not why we should make mistakes, of course, but it's something good that comes out of bad. And that's what this story is all about. God making good out of bad. Our mistakes, even our time in the pit, God can use for good. So that's Reuben. And then a really, really, really important character in this story is Judah. He's really important, and you'll see that as it goes along. Judah becomes, this is really the beginning of Judah, and we know who comes through Judah. So you want to pay close attention to Judah. And Judah was Leah's fourth child, and she had these 4 boys right at the beginning when Rachel wasn't having any kids. Nobody else was having kids. And so, except for Leah, and then what happened is, so she's able to have kids, Rachel isn't, and she goes through the first 3, and still, he doesn't love her. Jacob doesn't, he doesn't love Leah. He loves Rachel. And so when she got to the 4th one, Judah, and this is a wonderful story. I heard a African American guy, preacher, give this sermon at seminary. He said, "And this time she will praise the Lord." This time, sister girl said, "I don't care what he thinks anymore. This time I'm going to praise the Lord." And that's what she named him. Judah means praise the Lord. So she got over it. Isn't that an awesome story? I can't preach it as good as he did. He did awesome. This time she decided it's not about what he thinks. This time I'm going to praise the Lord. And so Judah is that son. He's the 4th son. And he was actually next in the covenant running if you go by the order, because 2 and 3 had already messed up too, if you go back. 2 is Simeon and 3 is Levi. And they had a daughter named Dinah. So there was 12 brothers and the daughter. And Dinah had been dishonored in Shechem. And I don't have to go into all the details. You can read about it. It comes before Genesis 37. I think it's Genesis 34. But what they did in their anger, they were so angry that they tricked this family, and then they went and killed them all. So they killed an entire family in Shechem because they had dishonored, one of the men had dishonored Leah. And so Jacob said, "Do you realize what you've done? Now we, this little family that's just living in tents and moving around in this Canaanite nation, and they've been very kind to us, now we are a stench to them. Now we can't live here anymore. In fact, now we have to flee." So he was very angry about it, and they had to move. They were in Shechem, and that was the spiritual place, remember? And then they had to move, and had to move far down south. And so Jacob, in the blessings of the sons, he remembered that as well. When it came to them, he put them together and said, "Cursed be their anger, cursed be their wrath. Therefore I will scatter their descendants throughout the nation of Israel." And so, number 1, out. Number 2, out. Number 3, out. They're all out at this point in Jacob's eyes. So, number 4 is the next in line. Judah has the opportunity. But Judah makes a big mistake. He sells his brother for 20 pieces of silver. Now, Jesus had to have the I am Joseph moment when Judas, which is a name that comes at the same root as Judah, sold him for 30 pieces of silver. Inflation. He had to, Jesus knew the Joseph story. Didn't Jesus say, "I am Joseph"? Didn't he know that? I mean, how about that for a connection? Judah sells you for silver? Judas sells him for silver, betrays him, his brother, one of the 12. You know, imagine watching your brother take money into his hand and for you to be tied up and taken away from everything you know, to be sold. Imagine that. See, Judas had not transformed, had no transformation to empathy yet. He had not learned. And so he was only thinking of himself. In fact, he said, what profit is there gained if we kill our brother, is what he said. And the word profit is actually, that word is not profit as in a prophetic person, but profit is in money. And it's not only money gained, it's gained illegally. It's gained through fraud or extortion or slave trade. And so he said, where's the bad money in that? If we just kill him, killing him, we get no bad money. Sell him, we get some bad money here, guys. Only thinking of himself. Another important detail is the Ishmaelites. There's no detail that doesn't matter. They sold him to Ishmaelite traders. Who's Ishmael? Remember? Abraham had two sons, Isaac and Ishmael. He had some other sons later on. But those were the two main ones. And it was very clear that the covenant went through Isaac, not Ishmael. God would bless. And Abraham said, why don't you just have the covenant go through Ishmael? And God said, no, Sarah is going to have a child, and the covenant's going to go through her. And so go through her, through Isaac, through her child. And so Ishmael is the one that God has not chosen. And Judah then sells the covenant, Joseph. Joseph is the one that looks like he's going to get the covenant, the one that God has blessed, the one that the Father has put a special code on, the one that's having the dreams from God. It's going to be him. He's going to be the covenant person. But Judah then sells the covenant to Ishmael, Ishmael's descendants, the ones that God had not chosen. So think about, he is defying not only his brother, but he's defying God. He's not thinking of God's story. So, and we're going to see, this is Judah's mistake, and he's going to make more, but we're going to see some transformation and some growth out of Judah. And so the good news is, there's a lot of darkness in this story with the pit, but there's light. In that the good news is that there's no mistake, there's no pit in our life, in our past, that God can't make some good out of. There's nothing that can stop God's story. Okay, you might feel like God has thrown you in the pit, but guess what? That's not going to, he can pull you out. He's got more to your story. There is more. Tomorrow is a new page. God is a good storyteller. Yes, there's pits that we seem to fall into. There's pits that we crawled into through our own mistakes. There's lots of those too. That our loved ones accidentally pushed us into or intentionally pushed us into. There's pits in life. But that doesn't stop God's story. That can't stop him. It didn't stop him here. Joseph was left for dead. But God had more. There was more going on. There was more story. And God's a good storyteller. And yes, we can't always make good out of something bad that's happened, but God brings good. God does something new and something good. And we change. And we can do good things. So, God's going to work. Give him a chance. He's a good storyteller. Live into his story. And so what we want to do right now is we've got our altar piece here, And we want to think about what we want to write on there. And so we want to spend, like Jesus, we want to take a few minutes and we want to spend it in solitary. We want to be quiet with God, connect with Him, pray, and move to His mission. So just spend a couple minutes in quiet before we have worship, and let God speak.